So, welcome back to the next round of Petman Academy musicianship classes. I hope you've enjoyed the last few weeks and you're all ready for level 2 and going back to your schools on Monday, and I wish you all the very best with that. Today we're going to move forwards. The last time I saw you, we looked at Baroque music. We looked at the music of J.S. Bach and Georg Friedrich Handel, being composers from the same period, but quite different in terms of their backgrounds, their history, and in terms of their musical output. If you remember, Bach lived a fairly sheltered life. He didn't really become famous as a composer until a century after his death. Felix Mendelssohn revived a lot of Bach's music, whereas Handel was always in the public eye and thrived on, first of all, writing operas that were very popular in London during his lifetime, and also writing ceremonial music like Zadok the Priest, the Hallelujah Chorus from the Messiah, and all that sort of thing. So today we're going to move forwards. We're going to move forwards to the classical period. So, and in particular, I'm going to focus on a very important composer from that time. That's Joseph Haydn. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen with you and talk you through a few things about Haydn and his music and what classical music means. So here we go. So just bear with me for a moment. Okay. So if I go into PowerPoint, here we are. All right, so Joseph Haydn and the classical period. So Haydn was born in 1732, just outside Vienna, on the border between Austria and Hungary. He was a very important composer during the classical period. He lived for quite a long time, for 77 years, which back then that was a very long life. And he made a very significant contribution to all genres of music, from the symphony, opera, choral music, but in particular, he made a massive contribution to the development of chamber music, in particular, string quartets and piano trios. And I'm sure a lot of you have been working on string quartets and piano trios during the past couple of years with the Petman Academy. Maybe some of you have come across some chamber pieces by Haydn. He really revolutionized that genre of music. If you haven't come across his music yet, I do urge you to explore more and consider playing some Haydn with your ensembles and with your teachers. It's very, very outstanding music. And Haydn spent much of his life working for the wealthy Esterházy family, just out in a place called Eisenstadt, which is just outside Vienna, again, not far from the Austrian-Hungarian border. The Esterházy family, the Prince Esterházy was a very wealthy man. It was a very wealthy family. So Haydn actually, for the large part of his life, earned a pretty large salary as a musician, which for a lot of people was quite rare at that time. He also gave musical lessons to young Mozart and also to Beethoven towards the latter stages of his life. So he was a very big influence on both Mozart and Ludwig van Beethoven. He's also famous for making 2 journeys to London during the 1790s, and he spent quite a number of years living there, and he wrote some of his most famous works, especially the so-called London symphonies, and we'll talk about those a little bit in a few lectures' time. The amount of symphonies that Haydn wrote is quite phenomenal if you compare him to other composers. As far as we know, he wrote at least 106 symphonies during his lifetime. They're the ones we know about. He may well have written more that have been lost or not heard of. And for that, he was nicknamed the father of the symphony. He was also nicknamed the father of the string quartet as well. And really, there's no composer that surpassed Haydn's symphonic output, both in terms of quantity and quality. So many of his 106 symphonies are unique. They do something quite different to what other composers were doing at that time. Of course, Beethoven's, Mozart's symphonies, Mahler's symphonies, Tchaikovsky, etc., were all absolutely fantastic in terms of quality, but of course they didn't write as many symphonies as Haydn. Beethoven wrote 9, Mahler 9, Tchaikovsky 6, Mozart 41, etc. And a lot of Haydn's symphonies were given nicknames, generally not by Haydn himself, but they acquired these nicknames a bit later on, after Haydn had died. So we have the 94th Symphony, written in 1791, called The Surprise, the Military Symphony, because it uses military-sounding instruments, trumpet calls, and percussion, from 1793 to 94. 101 is nicknamed The Clock. 103, nicknamed the Drum Roll, and 104 is nicknamed the London. And there's many, many more, but in particular, his symphonies that were written towards the end of his life during the 1790s have been given nicknames. Today, I'm going to go back a little bit earlier in Haydn's life. Not when he was really, really young, not when he was a child or a teenager, but I'm going to look at the late 1760s. And here's another symphony, number 26, that's also been given a nickname. Once again, it wasn't Haydn's name, but it was one that was popularized later. And that name is Lamentation. It's not one of Haydn's best-known symphonies, and you don't tend to hear it performed that much today, but it does contain a lot of interesting and unusual features. And it's also a good starting point when we're studying the classical symphony in general, because it follows a lot of the structures. It uses quite a small orchestra, and hopefully it will help us to get more familiar with a musical genre that really revolutionized the entire history of classical music. When writing this symphony, Haydn incorporated an old plain song melody from the Passion of Christ. Now, plain song dates back to the Middle Ages, in fact, the 11th, 12th century. I'm not exactly sure of the date of this plain song melody, but Haydn uses it in this symphony as the second theme of this symphony. And audiences at the time would have been very familiar with this plain song melody. I'll point it out when we listen to it and look at the musical score in a few moments' time. It was written around 1768, 1769, and this was written during a period called Sturm und Drang, which means storm and stress. So I'll explain exactly what that means. You might be able to hazard a guess for yourselves just by looking at those words. So Sturm und Drang, storm and stress, which actually literally translates as storm and drive, but storm and stress is the more popular English translation. Sturm und Drang was very popular around the 1760s, 1770s, not just in music, but also in fields of art, literature, and music. And a fine example of Sturm und Drang artwork can be seen here in this painting by Claude Joseph Vernet called The Shipwreck. It dates from 1772. And just have a look at some of these. If you look closely at the image, it's quite a sort of frightening scene of this storm and the shipwreck, people panicked, the lightning bolt in the distance, another ship in the distance struggling, the haunted looking castle, the dark clouds. This was a really, we could spend a whole session analysing this painting, but we're here to look at the music. But it just gives you an idea of the Sturm und Drang period and the sort of things that artists were trying to represent. It's really a precursor of what would come later in the 19th century known as Romanticism, or the Romantic period. Again, that's a term that can be applied to music, art, and literature. And what we see in Sturm und Drang is artwork that's aimed not to sort of charm and please and look all nice like so much artwork from the mid 18th century, was representing, but actually it's trying to disturb, alarm, and even frighten, you might say, the viewer or the listener. And it's trying to display very emotional extremes. There's a lot of emotion that the artist has tried to capture into this picture. Frightening, panic, alarm, scariness, hauntedness. And I do urge you, if you want to look for more examples of Sturm und Drang artwork just by a search through the internet. I'd be interested to know what you come across. But anyway, back to the music. Here's some features of what Sturm und Drang, storm and stress in music. One of the main features of this style is that it was written in a minor key. We also often see large leaps in the melody. It might be a leap of a seventh, a ninth, an 11th, large melodic leaps, and also often an unpredictable shape of the melody. It doesn't always follow a nice flowing tune, but rather moves off into unexpected directions. We also see in Sturm und Drang style often quite abrupt changes of dynamics and sometimes even sudden changes of tempos or speeds. We don't see all of these at the same time, but in certain Sturm und Drang works from the 1760s and 1770s, we can make out some of these features. We also see rhythmic syncopation. That's really important. Syncopation is kind of where the rhythm moves onto the offbeat. So some instruments might stay playing on the beat whilst other instruments are playing against the beat, if you like. So here's an example of a syncopated rhythm. If I count myself in floor, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. We also, in the string part writing, find a lot more tremolos than would have been otherwise typical from this period, and sometimes sudden accents as well. Again, obviously the tremolos is sort of creating that frightening atmosphere that the composer in a piece of Sturm und Drang music would want to convey. And overall, I would say the music is conveying difficult or even depressing feelings. It's trying to evoke these sort of difficult feelings into the listener. So we're going to have a look at Haydn's 26th Symphony to see how Haydn does this and how many of these features, I'll just go back, we might see in Haydn's music. I don't expect to see all of them, but hopefully we'll find some of them. So, Haydn's Symphony number 26, and we're just going to look at the first movement today. It's written in D minor, okay? Again, that was very, very common for Sturm und Drang music, was the use of a minor key, or at least it begins in a minor key. And in fact, Haydn's 26th Symphony was the first of his symphonies to be written in a minor key. All his previous symphonies, up to number 25, were written in a major key. He also uses quite a small orchestra. Now, we're talking about fairly early, in 1768, we're talking about fairly early in the classical period. So we don't expect to see orchestras of the size that Beethoven, who was of course in the late classical, even early romantic period. A much smaller orchestra, comprised mainly of strings. We don't know exactly how many strings Haydn intended it to be written for, but we do know that whilst he was working at the Esterházy family, we know from records, from archival records, that he had 6 violins, splitting the first and second violins between them. Then he had 3 lower strings, probably 1 viola, 1 cello, and 1 bass. That was the number of string players that were employed in the orchestra at the Esterházy residence in Austria. He also writes for 2 oboes, 2 horns. These would have been natural horns, not valve horns like we know today, but natural horns. And I discussed what a natural horn was with you when we looked at Handel a few weeks ago. Also 1 bassoon, And we still see the continuo, which might be a harpsichord. We still see that in this work by Haydn. We often tend to associate the continuo with the Baroque period, but in the case of Haydn, in some of his early symphonies, he did continue to use the continuo. So that's sort of a hangover from the Baroque period that moves into the early classical period. All right, so look, let's have a listen. Here I've written out a few pointers that we might want to listen for. So we're looking for minor key. Remember, as I said, most mid-18th century pieces were written in major keys because they were less disturbing in terms of sound to the listener. We're also looking for examples of tense harmony, and what you might find is noticing that Haydn uses quite a lot of diminished seventh chords. If you've done music exams, you might well have been asked to play a diminished seventh chord. Haydn uses a lot of these in this movement. Again, it just adds to the tension, the tense feeling. We'll also hopefully spot some syncopation. And again, these syncopated rhythms create tension. It's also written something called sonata form. This was a way composers used to structure their pieces during the classical period. I'll explain a little bit more about sonata form in a moment. But to begin with, let's just have a listen to the whole first movement, which is quite short. It's only about 4.5 minutes long. By the time we get to the end of the classical period, we see first movements being up to 15, even 20 minutes long. So this is still quite short for a first movement of a symphony. So I'll just come out of here and I'll play and I'll show you the score. So here we go. Syncopation here. This is the plain song. This is chorale. All right, so hopefully you noticed some of these features. And we will go back and break it down in just a second. But first of all, I want to talk you through that last point, sonata form. So sonata form, or it's sometimes called the sonata principle, is a way that composers used to structure their work as sort of a guideline. And we see it in symphonies, especially in the first movement of symphonies, but we also see it in piano sonatas, in string quartets, and several other works as well. This is a typical model of a sonata form. They don't always follow this model, but this is a typical guide. So we start off with what we call an exposition. This is where the composer's two main musical ideas, it's normally two, sometimes it can just be one, sometimes it can be three. Main musical ideas are exposed, if you like. The two contrasting themes are called subjects. So we have a first subject and a second subject. And they're usually contrasting in nature. So the first one will have some quite distinctive features compared to the second one. Then we move into, and then the exposition is usually repeated. Then we move into the development section. And this is where the composer develops, if you like, that some or all of the musical ideas that are heard in the exposition. He or she might play around with the melody a little bit and decorate it. They might move it into a different key. Then there's all sorts of other things. Then we have the recapitulation, which is basically a repeat of the exposition, but normally making sure that the music returns to the home key. So if it starts in D minor, the composer needs to make sure that it ends in D minor. Doesn't always work like that, but usually it does. And then finally, we finish with a coda, which is basically the ending. It's where the composer perhaps drags out that final cadence to bring the music to a convincing close. So that's the typical structure of the sonata form. Now let's have a look at what Haydn does in this particular work. And we'll go back over the music and listen to it, and I'll stop and pause in various places. So we're going to start off with the exposition. So we have our first subject, or our first theme, if you like, between bars 1 and 16. So let's just go back, just bear with me while I go back and look at some of the features. Here we are. And I'll play it to you. So here we go. Okay, I'll pause there. So what did we see here? Well, here we have the very clear syncopation. The rhythm, if you look at the cellos, basso, bassoon and viola, the rhythm there is on the beat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Whilst the first and second violins and sometimes the oboes are going da, da, like that. So we've got that syncopated 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So we can call this our sort of syncopated theme. Changes a little bit. There's a bit of a contrasting answer, if you like, here in bar 9, the piano bit. But then we come back to the syncopation at bar 13. So that is really our first musical idea, our first theme, this syncopated idea. Okay, what happens next? So now we're going to move to our second subject between bars 17 and 44. So let's have a listen to that. Okay, so what do we see there? Just drag it back again. So first of all, we have, as I spoke about, that old historic medieval plain chant melody, etc. So that's a very different theme, a different musical idea to that, to the that we hear in the first subject. So we've got a very contrasting theme. Immediately, much less syncopation, a more flowing accompaniment as well, in particularly in the first violins, a flowing quaver accompaniment. We also have a change of key. So here, from the beginning, as I mentioned, was in D minor. Here we've moved to F major, which of course is the relative major of the original key, D minor. It's quite common as well for the second theme or the second subject in sonata forms to be in a related key. Sometimes it might be subdominant, sometimes dominant, sometimes relative, the relative key. And in this case, Haydn moves his second subject into the relative major. So that's F major. And he finishes the first subject, and indeed the whole of the exposition, on a cadence in F major. All right, so now we are going to listen to the development section. I'll just move it forward a little bit. Here's the end of the exposition. Coming to the start of the development here. So what do we hear there? Well, Haydn is developing that first theme. We're back to the syncopated theme, but we're in a different key. We're in F major. So at the beginning, we heard it in that rather tormenting, frightening D minor. Now it's in the syncopated theme, is back, but it's in the relative major. So it's in F major. So that's one way that Haydn is developing that first subject. Let's move on. Okay, so I'm going to pause it here. Bars 57 to 63, this passage. We've still got the syncopated idea going, etc. But we have an important musical device that's heard in not just classical music, but also it's used a lot in popular music as well. And it's called the circle of fifths. And we can very clearly see that from the top part here, from the oboe part. We've got D going to G, C to F, B flat going to E. And here we have a circle of fifths. We've got a G minor chord here, then moving on to a C major chord, then on to an F major chord. Incidentally, these are all in first inversion. So G minor in first inversion, C major in first inversion, then F major in first inversion, B flat major in first inversion, etc. And Haydn is using a very important musical device there called the circle of fifths. It's easier to sort of tell how it works by listening to it. So don't worry too much if you don't understand all the technical complexities of that. But it's a circle of fifths that we're hearing there, going round the keys. All right, let's move on. So, what did we notice here? Again, we have these sort of swells. If we look at bar 69 particularly in the first violin part. What we have there is an ascending diminished seventh chord to add to this tension. Rising and then falling away in bar 70. The same thing in bar 71, this rising diminished seventh, then the tension disappearing. And that's all contributing to this sort of storm and stress, Sturm und Drang effect. Okay, let's continue. And then here, back to our recapitulation. Okay, so here the development section ends. The development section ends at bar 80, and we have the recapitulation section now. It returns in the original key. It returns in D minor, and we hear again that first theme, the first subject, the syncopated theme. He tracks it on a little bit more than he does in the exposition with this pedal note in the horns. And then what happens next? Let's have a listen to the next bit. Okay, so that is the second part of the recapitulation. It's a return, and it comes in at bar 100. It's a return of the second subject. It's a return to that chorale-like plain song melody with the flowing quavers, less syncopation, and again, that proceeds all the way through like that, with constantly flowing all the way through. The first violins have got constantly flowing quavers, so it's quite a contrast from the first subject and all the syncopation. And we also have transitioned into D major, so that is called the tonic major. We started in D minor, but Haydn's going to finish the movement in D major. And then finally, so that gets us to bar 126, and finally we have the coda, which is just like an extension, just to really fully round off the piece with a full and proper perfect cadence. So let's have a listen to the coda. All right, so I'll just go back, and here, yeah, I've just summarized all of those thoughts on this slide here. So I do urge you to start exploring a bit more of Haydn's music, because you may and probably will come across it at some point in your chamber and solo musical performances. He wrote some fantastic works for orchestra, opera, chamber ensemble, solo piano, the list is endless. So yeah, that brings us to the end of this session on Joseph Haydn, but we've focused particularly on Haydn's earlier years, the Sturm und Drang, storm and stress, the early part of what's known now as the classical period. So next week we'll probably do a little bit more on Haydn, and then we might look at Mozart and Beethoven and what happened towards the end of the classical period and how we gradually started to transition into Romanticism, the Romantic period that became so popular in the 19th century. So I look forward to seeing you next week. Enjoy the start back at school on Monday, and see you soon. Bye-bye.